Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's a new year. Happy New Year to everyone. I still haven't painted the wall, but we're back with a new video, so let's get straight into it. So what I've got here is a DJI Action 2 ND filters by Freewell. Freewell actually a very good company. They make your ND filters for your professional cameras as well. Generally their products are very high quality and nothing changes here. The quality of the product is very good, and it also doesn't mess with the quality of the footage from the DJI Action 2. But we're going to get into all that in a minute. But there's also one caveat as to maybe why you shouldn't be using these ND filters or any ND filters for your action cameras. We're going to get into that later on in the video. But first, let's get into it. So Freewell sent over a bunch of different types of filters. When you get them out of the box, they come in these cases, which are actually quite good for transporting the filters around, although they're a bit difficult to get them in properly, and this box actually came with one rattling around inside. The options here were as follows. The first pack is a standard day pack, and that includes ND8, ND16, ND32, a CPL circular polariser filter, which we'll get into in a minute. The bright day pack includes the following ND filters, which all have the polariser built in: ND8, ND16, ND32, and ND64. And finally, it also got the separate ND1000 filter, which we'll get into as well. And it's worth noting that you don't have to buy these as packs. You can actually buy each individual filter on its own. So why do you need ND filters? And I'm going to put time codes down below in the description, so if you already know the answer to this, then you can skip to the next section. Basically, the rule of videography is that your shutter speed should be double what your frame rate is. So if your frame rate is 30 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/60. If your frame rate is 60 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/120, and etc. This is because these settings produce the correct motion blur, which you're used to seeing in high-end productions. And there's an argument that if you don't have this motion blur in your films, it takes away from the action. Here's an example of a car going past in 1/1250 shutter, and you'll see if I pause it, the car is clear as day. Whereas if I go to 1/60 in this shot and pause it, you'll see the blur in the car, and this is the correct motion blur. Are you really a filmmaker if you're not using ND filters? Well, yeah, you definitely can be. I've been filmmaking for maybe 8 years now, and I've never used an ND filter for any professional work. And the client has never noticed, never complained about anything. So yes, you can get away without using ND filters, but it's a good habit to get into, especially if you're getting into that high-end production value stuff. The ND1000 is actually a little bit different. You're not going to be using this for video to get your shutter speed correct. You're probably going to be using this for photography to get those long exposures, so you can set the shutter speed to like 8 seconds, 7 seconds, and get some nice shots. So these filters are pretty well designed. They're attached via magnets and cover up the whole front of the Action 2, making it look like some sci-fi action camera from the future. The magnets only work in one orientation, so you do have to line it up every time, but that's not a massive deal. Despite it being magnets, it's quite strong. I don't think it would fall off in normal use. You really have to sort of, I say that and then it just fell off. But you do really have to sort of push it. So if you're sort of moving it around like this, it's not going to fall off. It's only really going to fall off if you're hitting it. I do think if you dropped it on the floor, then these magnets would fall off. Getting onto the CPL filters now, which is a circular polarizer, and what these basically do is take the edge off of the highlights a little bit. So if you've got a scene that's pretty well balanced, but you've got some really strong highlights in a part of the scene, the circular polarizer will just bring them down a little bit. An extreme example of this is this shot directly at the sun. You'll see in the shot of no filter, the brightness of the sun spills out quite far and you lose all of that data. But then if you put a CPL filter on, it doesn't spill out as much and you recover some of that data in the sky. Again, this is an extreme example, but you can see it again here in this shot of the sea. The ND1000 again works really well for that long exposure photography, and you can turn a shot from this into this. So Freewell have done a really good job with these ND filters, but there are definitely a couple of things you should know before you use ND filters on your action cameras. So the whole point of using ND filters is to bring your shutter speed down to 1/60, 1/120, whatever that might be, that's double your frame rate, so you get that proper motion blur. But the problem is, cameras like the DJI Action 2 use digital image stabilisation. And this actually relies a lot on shutter speed to work efficiently and effectively. I'm not sure exactly the reason, maybe the motion blur interferes with the stabilisation a little bit, but that kind of explains why you see bad stabilisation in low light on these cameras. So all of that basically means that when you are using the 180-degree shutter speed rule on the action cameras, the footage almost becomes unusable. Check out the shots of me running here. I've got a shot of me running with no filter with a 1/1250 shutter. You'll see stabilisation is working incredibly well here. But when I switch over to 1/120, still on a similar exposure, the stabilisation becomes more or less unusable. So personally, I don't think you should ever really be shooting at these low shutter speeds. unless you're on a tripod, and turn off the rock steady stabilisation. I feel like the sweet spot here is probably around 1/500 with that digital stabilisation. So the next issue I had wasn't anything to do with the quality of the ND filters or using the ND filters at all. It's more of a limitation with the small cameras like these, and that was the fact that I only ever needed ND8. 16, 32, 64 was a bit overkill, even on the brightest days. And I think that's because of the size of the sensor in these things. They don't let in as much light, obviously, as full frame cameras, and so you don't need as strong ND filters to bring that shutter speed down, even in bright sunlight. So it's debatable whether you actually need ND32 or 64 on these cameras. I think maybe the only occasion might be skiing, on a skiing holiday when there's lots of like bright sky, obviously the bright floor as well with the snow. That might be the only time you need it, but if in normal sunlight conditions, you don't really need anything more than ND8. So here's my thoughts. This product is well designed, it's great quality, and you won't be disappointed if you are looking for ND filters for your DJI Action 2, as long as you know the limitations of using ND filters on action cameras. I feel like it's the most useful for people filming in extremely bright environments, like again, sort of a skiing environment or something like that. Or also someone who's filming a bit more of a cinematic video with their action cameras. Doesn't require too much bouncing around, and therefore when you do put that shutter speed down, you're not relying too much on that stabilisation. Either way, my personal recommendation is to go for the individual purchases. Get yourself an ND8 with a CPL filter on it, maybe just a CPL filter on its own, and also the ND1000, which is a lot of fun to play with for long exposure photography. And the Freewell filters for the DJI Action 2 come highly recommended from me. So that's been it from me. If you liked this video or found it informative at all, hit that thumbs up button. If you want to see more videos like this on filmmaking on the go, then subscribe and hit the bell notification button. And if you've got any questions or comments on the DJI Action 2 or the filters, then leave them in the comment section. I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.